We are in chapter 12. Chapter 12 is the chapter that describes the Beinoni. The Beinoni being an individual who initially we thought was just an average individual, and we thought we're pretty much must be a Beinoni. And we've subsequently discovered that a Beinoni is a very advanced spiritual state, and the Beinoni is somebody who never succumbs to something which is inappropriate, never does contrary to what Hashem wants. So that's a very advanced state to live in. And we've essentially come to the conclusion, I think many of us, that Beinoni might be out of reach. So the last thing that we learned was the principle that Hashem has designed every single one of us. It's the nature of a human being to have moyach shalit al halev, that the mind is able to control the heart. And that's our nature. But tuldosoi, that is the way that we were designed. It's from birth. It is the nature of the human being. It's even wired into the anatomy of a human being. That's why we stand upright. So that's very clear that the mind is higher than the heart, which illustrates that the mind is able to control the heart. And because of that, that effectively tells us a number of things. Firstly, it tells us that the Beinoni, even after they've had this incredible experience of prayer, which elevates and transports them into a different reality where they feel similarly to the spiritual awareness that a tzaddik would have, and then they come, so to speak, crashing down afterwards. So they still have, as we've discussed, they still have this sort of prayer afterglow that allows a person to feel that they have the upper hand, they're able to overcome their negative impulses. And that ties in very, very much with this principle of moyach shalit al halev, that the nature of people is that the mind controls the heart. Now, we kind of touched on, but I'd like to expand on it a lot more this time, the principle of the fact that the mind controls the heart is associated with the principle that a little bit of light pushes away a lot of darkness. So I don't recall if we read that inside or not, but that's really where we're going to be speaking this evening. So if you've got the Tanya in front of you, it's on page 50, and it's about a third or maybe a quarter of the way down the page. And for those of us who are looking on screen, so it's I'll get it to you right now onto the screen. Let's go a little further. 1 second. Okay, it's not. Now the screen is giving us a little bit of trouble, so just give me a moment over there and we're going to sort this out. But in the meantime, what we're going to be talking about, so it's just important for us to know, is this principle that in addition to the fact that we say moyach shalit al halev, that the mind has the capacity to control the heart, it's also a very important part of this conversation to identify that what we call ma'at oir, a little bit of light, is able to push away a lot of darkness. That's going to be a big focus of what we're going to speak about this evening. As soon as I can get that onto the screen, then we'll be able to start. If you do have the book, in the meantime, we can have a look in the book. The line starts, we're going to start with a quotation. The line starts Kiddush Siv. It's about 6 or 7 lines, excuse me, from the top of the page. So that's where we're going to start. It's a quotation from King Solomon. And what's important about the fact that it's a quotation from King Solomon is that the Alter Rebbe shares the quotation slightly differently to how King Solomon himself says it. And that's going to be one of the important things that we're going to identify here, because when you read King Solomon's words, you get the impression, King Solomon is a very great person, and so that's why he was able to have this very elevated experience of spirituality, which is that you can use just a little bit of light and dispel a tremendous amount of darkness, and you might think it's actually not referring to you and I. So that's why the Alter Rebbe, as we're about to discover, is going to specifically quote this line slightly differently. He's going to leave out a word, and his message is that the power of the mind to control the heart and the power of a little bit of light of the soul to have a tremendous impact on the world is universal. It's something that applies to every single one of us. So that's going to be very, very important information for us, because we need to know that while we look at the Beinoni and we think of the Beinoni as being somebody who is so elevated that it might be potentially out of reach, the whole purpose of Tanya is to tell us, well, the Beinoni is our aspiration. And if we have doubts about this, well, that's why we need to know that there's this non-disproportionate kind of impact that our neshama can have on the world in which we live. And that's because a little bit of light has such a tremendous impact, and a little bit of light is able to dispel a lot of darkness. We all have a little bit of light inside of ourselves. It's quite a nice time to be learning this, because the Torah portion this week is Behaloischa, which is all about lighting the menorah. And we know that one of the great symbolisms of the menorah is that it is supposed to represent the soul, because the soul is compared to a flame. So lighting the menorah and having all of these flames, and particularly the way that the Torah speaks about it, that it's Behaloischa Saneros, that it's about elevating the flame, not just simply kindling the flame, but creating a sense of elevation. That is something which speaks directly to the theme of what we're going to be speaking about over here this evening. Okay, so let's try this again to get it onto the screen. Okay, there we go. Kidirsiv. So if you're looking at the screen, it's the last line on the page. First word is Kidirsiv. If you're looking in the book on page 50, it's about the 6th or 7th line from the top of the page. And it is the word also Kidirsiv. Okay, so Kidirsiv. We've said that it is possible for a person, using the power of the mind and using the fact that the mind is an elevated faculty that we have, and that the way Hashem has wired us is that the mind should be able to control the heart. So every one of us is able to make this tremendous shift and able to elevate ourselves and able to overcome our negative impulses. Kiddirsiv, as the verse says. Okay, so this verse is going to be really pivotal to understanding what's going on in this particular conversation, and we're going to give it a fair amount of attention over here this evening. Kiddirsiv. So the verse says, V'ra'isi, this is King Solomon speaking, and he says, V'ra'isi, I have seen, sheyesh yisroin lechochma min asichlus, that there is an advantage to wisdom over foolishness, keyisroin ha'oir min hachoshech. In the same way as there is an advantage to light over darkness. So what the Alter Rebbe has modified in the way that he quotes this is, the original quotation says, V'ra'isi ani, which is a double expression, because the word Vera'isi already means I have seen. So by emphasizing Vera'isi ani, almost makes it sound as if King Solomon is speaking about his own experience. And when we would read that, we'd say, because that's King Solomon. He's such an elevated personality, and he's the wisest person who ever lived, and he's a great tzaddik. So therefore, he is in a position that he could say, I have seen and experienced this incredible edge and advantage that light has over darkness and that wisdom has over foolishness, and we'd think maybe he wasn't talking about us. So the Alter Rebbe has deliberately overlooked that word ani, so we don't misunderstand the verse, and we don't misunderstand the message of the verse, and we recognize that whatever we're about to learn about wisdom versus foolishness and about light versus darkness is directly relevant to us. So let's begin this conversation by identifying what wisdom is compared to foolishness. I mean, let's be honest. You don't need King Solomon, the wisest of all men, to explain that there is an advantage to wisdom over foolishness. Anybody knows that. In fact, probably the fools also know that. Although I guess the ultimate fool would be the fool who believes that their foolishness is wisdom. And don't panic. These people exist. So what's his big announcement? I got news for you, ladies and gentlemen. I want to tell you something that nobody has ever heard before. There's an advantage to wisdom over foolishness. And for the same matter, what's the big deal in saying there's an advantage to light over darkness? Trust me, you live in South Africa, you understand very well that there's an advantage to light over darkness. Because every once in a while they test us and, they cut the electricity, and then you realize the advantage of light over darkness. And so what's his message? What we need to know is that King Solomon also describes the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara, the inclination that we have to the right things, the part of us that aspires to connection to Hashem, which is called the Yetzer Tov, the so-called good inclination, versus the Yetzer Hara, which is our impulsive negative side, our toxic side, which is very directly translated as the evil inclination. So King Solomon speaks about them as follows. He calls the Yetzer Tov Yeled Chacham Umisken, which is effectively a wise youth who is, anybody who lives in Israel will understand the word miskein. It means, nebuch, somebody who's a little bit of a shemzich, somebody who's not exactly the most powerful, the most charismatic, the most successful. So the implication is that in the world in which we live, the Yetzer Tov, the impulse to do the right things, is seen as the weaker force in our lives, and the less charismatic, the less colorful, the less attractive force in our lives. And unfortunately, that is often the reality for people. What does my Yetzer Tov want to do? Learn Torah again? Can't you come up with something that's a little bit more exciting, something that's a little bit more, creative? Learn Torah again. On the other hand, he refers to the Yetzer Hara, to the evil inclination, as Melech Zokein, an old king, Uchsil, who is also a fool. Now, one of the reasons that he refers to the Yetzer Hara as old and the Yetzer Tov as young is because that is the nature of our experience. In our early immature childhood years, we don't really have a very developed impulse for the right thing. Now, you've got to be careful how you say this, because children actually are quite impulsively good, and they tend to be naive, and they tend to be honest, and they tend to be all the things that adults wish they still had, or at least decent adults wish they still had. The ability to just be honest, the ability to accept people for who they are, the ability to retain optimism under all circumstances, to be appreciative of the things that you have in life, etc. But what a child doesn't yet have is the capacity to know how to push themselves to do things that are the right things, even when they're uncomfortable things. That's what a child is learning in childhood development, because the default state of the child is, I have needs, and everybody else is supposed to service my needs. That's actually why kids love parents when children are very young. Why do they love their parents? Because their parents provide for them. Why do they love their grandparents, maybe even more than their parents? Because their grandparents provide without judgment and without conditions. So that's exactly up the alley of a child, which is very much the language of the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara wants things that are nice, easy, on my terms, self-serving, and so on and so forth. So for that reason, we call the Yetzer Hara, the toxic or negative inclination within ourselves, we call that the old king, because it's been part and parcel of our reality for much longer than the mature side of ourselves, which starts to look beyond self and starts to learn about altruism and starts to consider other people and higher aspirations and so on and so forth. And that's why the positive inclination is called youthful or young. Young literally, because it hasn't been present in our system for that long. Okay, so again, on page 50, and we are now on this, I'm saying it's probably about the 9th line or so from the top of the page, 8th or 9th line from the top of the page. And the first word on this line is ha'or. So what you're seeing over here is that King Solomon defines the negative inclination that we all have, and we all have a negative inclination. Our negative inclinations don't all look the same. For one person, it's temptation to hedonism. For another person, it's a sense of arrogance. For another person, it's sloth and laziness. For another person, it's envy. So we all have a dominant, of course, many of us have a bouquet. We have multiple areas of negative behavior or negative inclination. But what's common to all of the negative inclinations is that we have is that they are foolish. At the end of the day, the part of us that wants to do something contrary to what Hashem expects, it's actually a foolish part of ourselves. And the Talmud, the Gemara talks about this, where the Gemara says that Ein Adam Oiver Avera, a person would never sin, Ella im kein nichnas bo ruach shtus, were it not for the fact that they had temporary insanity. So in the modern court system, temporary insanity is used as a mitigating argument. Well, because the person was in a state of temporary insanity, we should go easy on them. We shouldn't really punish them for the things that they've done wrong. In Judaism, a person would never have done anything wrong unless it were temporary insanity. And if you think about it, it's quite logical, because anybody who's thinking clearly doesn't do the wrong thing. Right? Nobody who is of sound mind says, you know what, I'm going to skip the red light. Unless, of course, you live in an environment where the culture is to skip the red light, in which case that might very well be a rational proposal. But at the end of the day, nobody does something which is harmful to themselves, even spiritually harmful. And I say even because we're much more conscious, obviously, of physical harm than spiritual harm. But we wouldn't do that if we were thinking clearly. If we understood the damage that happens when we speak badly about somebody else, we would not speak badly about them. If we understood the damage to ourselves, if we were to transgress any of the 630 or the 365 negative commandments, then we wouldn't transgress them. So therefore, when King Solomon says, I've seen an advantage to wisdom over foolishness, he's not talking generically about the fact that wisdom is greater than foolishness, because that's not a surprise to us. What he's saying is, in our own experience, he has seen the advantage to following the side of ourselves, the inclination that we have, that is wise, our positive inclination, which is not so popular. He has seen the advantage of that over the negative. So at that point, it sounds as if he's saying, well, if you make the right choices in life, it's better than making the wrong choices in life, which again is not really a surprise. Maybe we grapple with overcoming temptations, and that's why we often don't make the right decisions. But again, anybody of sound mind surely acknowledges that it's better to make good decisions than to make bad decisions. What's the big surprise over here? So what he's telling us, and this is why he compares it to light versus darkness, what he's telling us is that when you have a look at the wisdom within ourselves, and we all have wisdom within ourselves, you may think that wisdom is the quieter voice, and it's the less popular voice. And so you may think that while there's an advantage to listening to that voice, perhaps it's not so easy to listen to that voice. It's easier to listen to the compelling voice that says, eat, drink, and be merry. The compelling voice that says, have a great time. You deserve this. So what he's telling us over here is that Yisro, there's an advantage to the wise voice over the foolish voice within our own heads, meaning to say, even though it's quieter, even though it's less popular, even though it's less charismatic, even though it's less colorful, it has a secret that allows it to punch above its weight category. And we have to understand what that is. And that's why he compares the difference between this wisdom versus this foolishness to the difference between light versus darkness. Because if we understand the qualities of light versus darkness, it will help us understand the qualities of our own inner workings. So what's the difference between light and darkness? Notice what he says. He says, me'at or, right? Let's just go back and read it again. Well, he's actually going to use that word a little bit later. So he said, I've seen the advantage of light over darkness. Let's actually read it inside, and then we'll get the ratios. Pirush, what that means to say is this. Kamoy sheha-oir, just like in our own physical reality. Light, yesh lo yisreinu shlita, has an advantage, and it has power. Shala, it can even, so to speak, control al ha-choshech, over darkness. Shemi'at oir, because a little bit of light, doiche harbe min ha-choshech. So this is the first principle, the first of a couple of principles that we have to learn, or two major principles. But the first principle that we have to learn is that a little bit of light is able to overcome a lot of darkness. Now we know that physically, right? So if you're in a room, let's say that the room is, call it 400 cubic meters. That's the volume of space in the room. If that room is dark, so then you can argue that you've got 400 cubic meters of darkness. In order to see what's happening in that room, and in order to illuminate the room, you do not necessarily need 400 cubic meters of light. You could literally put a candle in the middle of the room, and of course, the candle is not going to illuminate the whole room completely, but it will totally change the space. You can actually now see what's going on. You can identify where the hazards are. You can identify which is the way out of the room. So a little bit of light is able to have a tremendous impact on darkness. And that is exactly what he wants to convey. The ratio or the relativity between our Yetzer Tov, our internal positive impulse, versus our Yetzer Hara, our internal negative impulse, is disproportionate. It's disproportionate for two reasons. Firstly, it acknowledges the fact that there is usually more darkness than light to begin with. In other words, we acknowledge the fact that there's probably more tendency, that we all have, greater tendency to do things which are inappropriate, and then we have to learn how to counter that with things that are appropriate. So that's the first thing to acknowledge, that there is probably a greater force of negative in our lives than positive, and not to despair, because the impact of the positive on that negative is disproportionate. So that's going to be a very important part of our conversation. So let's understand for a moment, what do we mean when we say ma'at or, a little bit of light, doiche harbe choshech, is able to dispel a lot of darkness. Let's understand that. The simplest way to understand it is, as I've just mentioned, that we are more likely to be inclined to do the wrong things. In other words, it is easier for a person to be lazy and to miss shul in the morning than it is to get up and go to shul in the morning. More of our day is going to be filled with things that are self-serving, like earning a living and entertaining ourselves and interacting with friends and exercising and eating and sleeping, than time that will be invested in doing things which are for Hashem, like studying Torah or davening or doing mitzvahs. That's just the natural ratio of how things are. But his message is far more profound than this. His message is ma'at or, that concept of a little bit of light, is actually a definition of the kind of light that we're speaking about over here. Now, it's important for us to acknowledge that right across all Jewish mystical teachings, we use light as a metaphor to represent divine energy, consistently. And we talk about different kinds of light to represent different modes of divine energy. So if we're going to speak about ma'at or, we may be speaking about a small quantity of light, so the candle on the table in the dark room. Alternatively, we might actually be talking about a light that is limited, small in its abilities, versus a darkness that is harbe, a darkness that is very great. Why would there be a light that is small versus a darkness that is great? Well, that takes us to one of the most intriguing concepts in Jewish mysticism. It's discussed in both Kabbalah and in Hasidus, and it helps us to contextualize many things about our world. And that is, there's a midrash which says, we actually spoke about this on Shavuos, there's a midrash that says that Hashem was boine oilamois umachrivon. It's actually Avos de Rabbi Nassan, if I'm not mistaken, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, which is not really a midrash in the classical sense. So, what does it say? That Hashem was boine oilamois, that Hashem created worlds, umachrivon, and he destroyed them. Now, it's a very misleading concept, and unfortunately, quite a number of people have gotten the wrong end of the stick about this idea, that God created worlds and then destroyed them. So, for example, you'll hear people suggest that that's how we have fossils on Earth, because they're from the previous worlds where Hashem, so to speak, experimented, and then he destroyed those worlds, and we still have the residue, and that's how we land up with stuff in our world which gives the impression of being billions of years old. But it's really an inappropriate suggestion that Hashem might have experimented and then failed and then tried again multiple times before he made our world. That works for Thomas Edison. That doesn't work for God. Lahavdil. God doesn't make mistakes. God doesn't have to experiment in a lab before he sees how it's actually going to work out. So the better understanding, and you'll also notice, by the way, that the expression is in the present tense. Boine is a present tense version of the word to construct. So boine oilamos means he is building worlds. Machrivon is also in the present tense, and destroying them. So that's a fascinating thought. And based on that, Jewish mysticism teaches us that we live in two parallel realities. There's a reality that Hashem consistently creates in a sustainable, structured way. And there is a parallel reality that Hashem constantly creates in an unstructured and unsustainable way. We give these names. So the reality that is sustainable is called Olam HaTikun. Now you'll recognize that word because people always use the expression Tikkun Olam. And effectively what they mean by that is making the world a better place, a more sustainable environment, caring about humanitarian issues, etc., which is a really cheap version of what tikkun really means. Tikkun means to create an environment that is whole, that is networked, that is well structured. So we have a reality called Olam HaTikun, where things are well structured. And it might surprise you to discover that planet Earth belongs to the reality of tikkun. And the reason it might surprise you is because when you read the news, you think that this place is far from sustainable and structured. It appears to be a world of chaos, and it appears to be a world of anarchy. And the answer to that is very simple. It's a little bit of a tangent, but it is a very simple answer. There are the systems that God created, and there's the chaos that humans create. So let's not confuse the two. The fact that humans entered a space which works really well, and then created mayhem in that space, does not undermine the value of the systems that God created. So God made a perfect environment with perfect ecosystems. If you ever want to check this, go out of the city, spend some time in nature, and it's a good reminder that the way Hashem created the world works. So that's called the realm of Tikkun. And there's a parallel realm which is called Olam HaToihu. Tohu means chaos. You might recognize that from the second line of the Torah. That the original state of creation was in a state of chaos. And that's not accidental because the Torah is telling us that right at the beginning of the creation story so that we'll already be aware of the fact that there is this chaotic environment. Now, the world of Tohu is not an environment that we experience. It is at a far more elevated spiritual reality. But it is a place of chaos and lack of sustainability. And we need to understand why. So before we can understand this, let's explore our own world, because there's a great parable in our own world to understand the difference between these two realities of tikkun and toihu. And that is electrical appliances. So if you have an electrical appliance, we will call that appliance a keli. The direct translation of a keli is a vessel. And a vessel is essentially something which is designed to be energized by something else. That's what a keli is. So, for example, you have a cup. A cup is a keli. The purpose of a cup is not to own a cup. The purpose is to fill it with some kind of a liquid and then use that liquid either to drink or to water your plants or whatever particular purpose it is. So a keli means any kind of an appliance which has no value until something is given or assigned to it so that it can have value. So an electrical appliance may have all these intricate working parts, but if there's no electricity, it's dead. So the appliance is a fantastic utility if it is powered. And if it's not powered, it's just dead weight. So what do we call the power? What do we call the energy that then flows in? So we're using the parable of electricity. So the electricity that now flows through the whole electrical grid into your personal home outlet, down the wire and into the appliance, that is what we call or. That's called light. Now we're discussing the advantage of light over darkness over here. So let's remind ourselves that whatever we're going to discuss about or, about light, is also, it's metaphoric for understanding Hashem's energy. So in the same way as when that energy flows down the wire into the appliance, then the parts start moving and the appliance does its job. So in the same way, when Hashem invests his energy, his or, into an environment which he has created, so he's built a structure, he's built a particular appliance, when he pumps it full of his energy, then it comes to life and it actually exists. So if there's no or, the keli is dead. If there is or, the keli is useful. What happens if there is a poor calibration between the amount of or and the capacity of the keli? In other words, what if we have a power surge? So now what's coming down the wire is too much electricity, and this appliance was not designed to handle this much electricity. What's going to happen? We all know what's going to happen because it's probably happened at some point. Certainly if you live in a place like Johannesburg where you have electrical storms. So one lightning strike and it can wipe out a whole lot of appliances in one fell swoop. Because too much or shatters the keli. It breaks the appliance. The appliance is no longer capable of working because it's been overloaded by energy. In the same way as this could happen to an appliance, it could happen to your cup. The cup is only useful if I fill it to the brim or less than that. The moment I keep filling it, the cup is no longer useful. So again, one of these wonderful South African experiences, there's a period of time where there's no water. And typically what happens is when there's no water, you'll always get somebody who opens the tap and forgets to close it. And that's when you discover that too much, in this case, water, although that is metaphoric of the or that we're talking about, that the keli can't handle, now becomes destructive. So just the other day, somebody told me the story that their helper who lives on their premises sends them a message in the middle of the night to say there's water coming through the ceiling. And it was exactly this. One of the kids had forgotten to turn off the tap. And there you go. It's the next thing. The basin is full and then it starts cascading down the sides and down the stairs and into the house. So we always have to have a healthy relationship between the or, the energy, the definition, the thing that gives value to the keli, to the receptacle, to the appliance that is supposed to receive it. If you don't have a healthy relationship, either the appliance is going to be dead or the appliance is going to be destroyed. So dead in the sense that it's not working, destroyed in the sense that it's overwhelmed.
Can I ask a question?
Might be a bit premature for the question, if you don't mind. Just because we've got to now translate this out of the metaphor into the spiritual, and then we could address the question, okay? Okay, so now let's understand what this means in terms of these parallel realities. So God creates a world. Let's just say planet Earth. Planet Earth, as we know, is a highly complex system. It has all types of organisms with all different capacities of what they're capable of doing. So you have minerals that don't really do much other than exist, and you have plants which are able to grow and to move and to propagate, and you have animals that have some level of intellect and social clusters, and then you have humans. So each one of these requires a different calibration of aura. For example, if you had to take a human soul and put it inside a plant, you can expect that there's going to be some kind of a breakdown. Now, that doesn't happen in the world of Tikkun. In our world, it's not possible that a human soul gets to live inside a plant. And I'm not going to get into the whole story of reincarnation and whether it's possible for a temporary state of a soul in an unnatural host. But the way that the world is designed, the energy suits the receptacle, the appliance that the energy is supposed to impact. And that's why the world works in a predictable fashion, so that every single, much to everybody's surprise, winter happens every single year. It's quite entertaining, of course, where people say, "Oh, it's so cold. What happened?" Yes, it's winter. It's an annual occurrence, and it's like clockwork. You anticipate these things are going to happen. You anticipate that the sun will always rise in the east and it will always set in the west, and that's not going to change. And you anticipate that people are going to grow older, and you anticipate if you plant seeds, they're going to grow, and if you plant apple seeds, you're not going to get pears. So everything kind of works. The world of Toihu, which is this parallel reality, totally different story. Toihu is such an advanced reality that there is mostly Or and not a whole lot of Kali. In other words, it's a place of almost blinding divine input, and the systems that God creates to house that input are fairly flimsy systems. Now, if that sounds a little bit abstract, here's a way that you could relate to it. We all have that friend. You have to be very careful that nobody sitting at the table thinks I'm talking about them. We all have that friend. That friend who has massive talent and is never capable, for some reason, never able to get their life together. So they've got this incredible talent, but it's just all over the place. Why? Because they're a Toihu person. There's a lot of Or, there's a lot of creativity or a lot of genius or a lot of musical ability, as the case might be, and they just can't seem to contain it in realism of this world. So we're constantly fighting with them and saying, you just got to get your life in order. Maybe you should get yourself an agent, and maybe you need a bit of coaching or whatever the case is. And they're just like all over the place. And they've got another great idea, and they're composing another new piece, and they're performing on this particular stage, but life itself is a bit shattered. So that would be a good metaphor for this world of Toihu. It's not a place of chaos because it's a place of anarchy. It's a place of chaos because there is just so much potential, so much power, so much input from Hashem that you actually can't contain it. So if we were to compare the two realities, Tikkun versus Toihu, we would say Tikkun is a reality of Ma'at Or. The energy has been calibrated in exactly the same way as it works in your house. The electricity that's flowing through your house has been calibrated. It's not the force that's coming out of the actual power station. It's gone through these step-down transformers, and what's coming out of your plug is now suitable for your appliances. So Ma'at Or, to get the system to work, we've actually had to diminish the amount of energy that's flowing. Whereas the realm of Toihu, Harbe Or, there's a lot of light. But you know what the irony is of a lot of light? Too much light is blinding. Too much light actually leaves you in the dark. Right? Think about it. When a person is blinded by light, you can't see. By the way, that's why in the Gemara, which often speaks euphemistically about uncomfortable or negative things, it calls a person who is blind the person with too much light in their eyes. Saginahor, too much light in their eyes. So when we're talking over here about a little bit of light overwhelming a lot of darkness, we're actually alluding to the fact that the part of us that belongs in the world of Tikkun, which has limited resources, certainly in our conscious reality, still has the power to overcome that part of us that is from the world of chaos, which feels brutishly powerful, but actually can be controlled. In other words, what we're saying is that our godly soul belongs to the world of Tikkun. Our godly soul, and by extension our Yetzer Tov, our positive inclinations, make sense. They know how to behave in a healthy way, which is Tikkun. And they know how to build a healthy relationship with God that isn't off the wall. It's our other side, our animal soul, and that's why we call it an animal soul, because it's chaotic. And the Yetzer Hara, the negative impulses that are all over the place, that are unpredictable. You don't know where it's going to take you. And sometimes it might appear to be so attractive and so valuable and so beneficial, and that's why we go down that wormhole, and then we discover that it's actually destructive. And when we think about the power and the tug of negative behaviors versus the conscientiousness of positive behaviors, we think, how's the good guy ever going to have the upper hand? That's what he's telling us. Me'at or, the component that comes from small, limited light, is designed to be doiche harbe choshech, to overcome all of that negativity, as strong and compelling as it feels, and despite the fact that it actually plugs into a very elevated spiritual source, and so therefore really actually has an edge. And perhaps the easiest way to appreciate that is the human being who's able to train the circus elephant. So there's great power, brute strength, that lack of understanding and appreciation of higher values, all being controlled and directed by the one who has maybe less power but more seichel, more structure. Okay, Shimron, your question. Go ahead. Or not. Either question went away or you forgot to unmute. That's also an option. Okay, so when you're ready, you'll just pop in. So there's an expression that we use, which is Rav Tevuos B'koyach Shor, that you, in the old days, obviously before modernized, industrialized agriculture, your biggest farm implement was an ox. And if you had an ox, you could plow your field, and if you could plow your field with an ox, it was much more efficient than trying to plow the field by hand. So what might have taken a few weeks by hand could take a day or so with the ox. So therefore the expression is Rav Tevuos B'koyach Shor, that there are many harvests that are produced through the power of the ox. That tells you two things. That tells you on the one hand that the ox is way more powerful than we are. And you think of the cliche of the bull in a china shop. Powerful doesn't only mean good. It could potentially be a very dangerous animal. Somebody recently told me, I don't know if this is true, maybe you know if it's true. Somebody recently told me that the most dangerous animal to encounter in the bush is the buffalo, because it doesn't give you the sense that it's going to attack. Whereas various other animals will first kind of mock charge or, paw the ground or whatever they're going to do to let you know that they're angry, and these don't. So the buffalo is essentially an extension of the family of the ox. Very dangerous, brute animal. And in fact, we were talking about it on Shavuos night with Yaakov from the butchery, from Moshe's, about which animals are kosher that nobody eats. That was one of them, because who's going to hold the buffalo down to be able to shecht it? Right? It's not possible. So you look at this animal, and it's actually it's quite a daunting thing to try and engage with an ox. It's not something we do in our world, obviously, but there was a time where that was normal. People used to buy an ox, and they used to have to break the ox in, and then it could pull the plow, and then you got so much more value out of the ox than you could have gotten out of your own physical efforts. And that's the message of here. Ma'at or, don't be afraid about the fact that the one is less light or less energy or less power, because the chap is that the one with less power, but with more structure, more focus, more planning, more strategy, is always able to play the one that's more powerful. I think in certain martial arts, that's what they teach you, right? That you use your opponent's power against them. Instead of trying to use your own power to engage your opponent, you actually flow their power in a way that undermines them. So that's the chap over here. The ma'at or, the one that has less, so to speak, energy, less power, less brute force, is actually the one who's capable of using the strategy to overcome, direct, and elevate the other. That's his message over here. I've seen the advantage, King Solomon says, of wisdom over foolishness, like the advantage of a little bit of light over a lot of darkness, because that's really the principle. Every single one of us has this moment, we look in the mirror and we say, I don't know how I'm ever going to get this right. I don't know how I'm going to overcome all these impulsive elements within my system. I don't know how I'm going to, quiet down the temptations that I have, or overcome the laziness that I have, or whatever the case is. So this is one of the most important things to consider, that a little bit of light is much more impactful than a lot of darkness. The second principle that he's going to teach us, which we'll try and still get through today, is how light impacts darkness. because that's really, really important as well. They tell a story, and it's obviously one of these more tongue-in-cheek stories about the guy, and I don't think it was here during load shedding. I think it was one of these older stories. Guy walks into a dark room, and he starts screaming at the darkness. Get out of here. You're interfering in my life. Now, you can scream till you're blue in the face. Obviously, nothing's going to happen. So his friend comes in. It's probably a Chelm story when I think about it. His friend comes in. He sees that he's screaming and yelling at the darkness. He says, you're crazy. You think you're going to get rid of the darkness by yelling and screaming? He goes and comes back with a baseball bat. Starts swinging wildly in the room to try and get rid of the darkness, which obviously is not going to get rid of the darkness and probably damage half the house in the process. Until eventually the wise person walks in and says, just light a candle. What that teaches us is a profound lesson about all of the spiritual struggles that we have. We all think we have to fight harder, where actually the message over here is we have to work smarter. So that's the next point that he's going to make. So he says, Sheme'at, I'm just going back a drop, Sheme'at or Gashmi, a little bit of physical light, Doiche harbe min ha-choshech, is able to dispel a tremendous amount of darkness. And then he tells us, Shenitche mimenu me'elov u'memela. The way that darkness moves out of the path of light is me'elov, of its own accord, u'memela, and automatically. I don't have to push out the darkness. I only have to generate light. It's one of the most important principles of all spiritual development, because we waste so much time and attention and energy fixated on how dark it is, fixated on the negative. This is my problem. This is the problem with the world. This is the problem with the leadership. This is the problem with the community. And then once we have identified those problems, then we waste so much energy on trying to fix things, particularly things that we actually have no jurisdiction over. So I'm going to come up with a plan of how the Israeli government should operate. Okay, that's very nice. I live over here. I'm going to have absolutely no impact on the Israeli government. And I could also come up with a plan of how I'm going to overcome the problems in our community, or the problems in our country, or even the problems in my own world. Whereas if a person invests in generating light, it's a natural consequence that the darkness will disappear. You don't have to get all worked up and physical and stressed. You just got to generate light. So me'at or is doiche choshech, that a little bit of light is able to push away a lot of darkness. But what's most important to know is me'elav or memela. It's a natural, automatic process. It doesn't require effort. It doesn't. Well, maybe generating light will require effort, but it doesn't require that push and that getting our hands dirty and all the stress that we tend to invest in trying to solve our problems. It's very interesting. There's quite a lot of scientific research that indicates that when people try very hard to fix something, it often doesn't work. And then when they give up, very often that's when the solution presents. So where you see this quite regularly is with people battling fertility issues, that you often hear the story that after they stopped treatment, then they fell pregnant naturally. It's a fascinating phenomenon. And similarly, you hear, often when people are brainstorming and trying to come up with a solution to something and they just can't seem to find the answer. And then when they're in a completely different environment, downtime, in the shower, playing golf, whatever it is, suddenly they have the solution. And that teaches us that fighting darkness is a waste of energy, whereas generating light is a guaranteed success. So we look at ourselves and we say, I have this Yetzer Hara, I have this negative inclination, and it is the part of myself that drags me down into all sorts of bad places. Rather than fighting it, rather than developing a whole complex strategy how I'm going to overcome it, I just need to start generating light. So let's complete the sentence. In exactly the same way as a little bit of light is able to dispel a lot of darkness, so to a little bit of positivity and experience of our own neshama automatically dispels a whole lot of the distraction and the temptation of our Yetzer Hara. So all we need to do is experience more of the light of our neshama. How do we do that? Well, we learned last time. The mind is the one that has to control the heart, so we have to feed the mind. And that's why we learn. That's why we learn Torah. It's not the only reason, of course, that we learn Torah, because it's what Hashem said. But the benefit of learning Torah is it bolsters and strengthens the mind so that we have that light of the neshama to be able to overcome all of the darkness of the rest of us. Okay, there is a lot more still to unpack on this particular topic, which please God we'll do next time.